And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, January 21st. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, with a new executive order clearing the path for federal AI standards, the question now is whether Congress will finish the job. Plus, a new year brings new opportunities. Where should contractors focus in 2026? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The 8A Small Business Contracting Program is coming under the microscope of its biggest user. The Defense Department is joining a growing list of agencies auditing the use of sole source contracts through the 8A program. For more on what DoD's decision to launch the audit means for the future of the 40-year-old program, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now. Jason, great to have you.
Thank you, Terry.
This is catching a lot of attention. Talk to us about why DoD decided to audit their 8A program.
I think the Pentagon's worried about two main things. I think they're first worried that the 8A program is a diversity, equity, inclusion, a DEI program. Now, that may be just the talk track of this administration. It's easy to pin that on many different things. But I think their bigger worry, and this is what we've seen from other agencies, is that it's just wrought with fraud, right? So according to DoD, there's a lot of fraud happening across all the 8A program, and they want to get to the bottom of it. And according to Leadership Connect, DoD spends a lot of money through the 8A program. I asked the folks to pull a little bit of data, and they said DoD made in 2025 2,556 awards under the 8A program, worth about $3.3 billion. Now, of those 2,500 plus awards, 2,100 awards, more than that, worth $2.7 billion were sole source awards. And that's really where Secretary Pete Hegseth is really focused on. He posted a video on X Friday last week explaining why he's concerned about the program and what DoD will do about those concerns.
I'm ordering a line-by-line review of every small business sole source 8A contract that is over $20 million. And we'll look at everything smaller than that, too. The Department of War has the biggest chunk of 8A spending, by far, 10 times more than any other agency. So our cleanup, it's going to be 10 times tougher. It's a two-stage mission. First, if a contract doesn't make us more lethal, it's gone. We have no room in our budget for wasteful DEI contracts that don't help us win wars, period, full stop. Second, we're doing away with these pass-through schemes. We'll make sure that every small business getting a contract is the one actually doing the work, and not just some shell company funneling your money to a giant consulting firm. This approach is, of course, not meant to hurt small businesses, and that's not the point. America is full of great, amazing small businesses. This is part of a larger effort to transform our acquisition ecosystem into one that makes sense for the threats we face in the 21st century.
Now, you heard Hegseth talk about specific sole source contracts worth more than $20 million. Now, that's a clear signal that DoD is worried about contracts going to Alaskan Native, Native American, Hawaiian Native corporations, tribal corporations, because Congress many, many years ago changed the threshold to say up to $100 million could those sole source contracts be given. So the fact he's calling out above $20 million, that's a direct threat against them. Now, I asked DoD for further comments, including a timeline, any other details of what the audit would entail, but I have not heard back yet from the press office.
Jason, DoD is going to join two other agencies who are already in the midst of auditing the 8A program. How does what DoD is going to do compare to what's happening at these other agencies?
The other two agencies, Treasury and SBA, also announced similar audits earlier this fall. In fact, SBA is looking at the entire 8A program, and companies had to submit their data to the agency by Monday earlier this week. Now, the SBA audit's very interesting because it's being driven by the General Counsel's office, which is a little bit unusual. Usually things are done by the Inspector General or maybe through a program office. I talked to John Shiraka, a former Associate Administrator of Government Contracting and Business Development at SBA. He's now the co-founder and managing director of Gov Contract Pros, an advisory services firm specializing in federal procurement. Now, he says while the questions being asked by SBA and eventually by DoD are legitimate questions, the approach is causing some chaos.
A lot of our clients reached out to their district office. The district office was actually unaware that those letters had originally gone out with respect to the audit. So there was a disconnect there. And they're really internally, again, the chaos is almost like the field offices aren't sure how the data is going to be used or who's going to use it or what they're looking at. From my perspective, given the types of questions that were asked, I think it leads to the question, is there the scenario of pass-throughs happening? Because there was a lot of questions with respect to who are your subcontractors, who are your vendors, et cetera. So the question is, and I think what SBA was looking at is, are there pass-throughs and who's really in control? Is the disadvantaged individual really owning, operating, and benefiting from the 8A company?
Now, Shiraka says it seems like DoD will be asking very similar questions. Hopefully, Terry, that means the companies will have very similar answers to what they gave the SBA.
Jason, I'm sure you've had your ear to the ground. What are some of the reactions you're hearing so far about DoD's audit decision?
The move by DoD makes companies, small business advocates, even more concerned about the future of the program, especially given the Pentagon is, again, the largest user of the 8A program. I talked to one former DoD acquisition executive who requested anonymity, and he said, while there are concerns about the use of sole source awards over $20 million to tribal companies, the allegations of fraud that the 8A program is a DEI program really are unfounded. And everyone I've talked to says, yes, no program is perfect. Yes, there are probably challenges. The 8A program probably has its share of challenges. But typically speaking, the 8A program is well overseen and well maintained. In fact, I talked to Norman Abdullah, who's with Huilala, a Hawaiian native corporation that is in the 8A program. He says most 8A firms spend a lot of time meeting the compliance requirements the government lays out, but it's also a shared responsibility with the government for oversight.
Several folks that have responsibility in there. The first one is the contracting officer. In some cases, they've got to approve subcontracts. But more basically, the 8A program is a small business administration program, and we go through a review every year where we have to submit our financials. What work did we do? What work happened? They worry about the business mix, how much of your work was set aside versus not set aside, quite honestly. What means you got the work by some means other than the 8A program, be that a subcontractor to another one, a straight commercial, et cetera. So there are lots of hooks to watch it. Do they audit the books per se to check for percentages? That's less common. It's part of your overall review unless there is a question.
Now, Shiraka also says there's a significant amount of regulations, requirements that try to mitigate the risks of these so-called pass-throughs. And most rules are allowing for legitimate subcontracting. Now, one thing all the experts pointed out is the program is set up to help 8A firms grow and learn, but they still have to do at least 51% of the work under the services side of the contracts and 15% of the work under construction contracts. Now, Shiraka added that there's probably more fraud in non-small business, non-socioeconomic programs across the government than there is in 8A and other small business initiatives, and that seems to be getting lost in this entire discussion.
Well, Jason, the fact that the big elephant in the room, DoD, is joining the audit, what does that mean for the future of the 8A program?
I think folks believe the future of the program is definitely in doubt. Now, Congress may not act to really change the law, which they would have to get rid of the program. But when you have SBA and Treasury and now DoD sending these signals, at least around sole source contracts, that the program doesn't work, there's a lot of concern that they just won't go forward with the program any longer. The former DoD acquisition executive tells me he believes the small business goals are going to be at risk across the board. They may not have an effect this year, but 2 to 4 years down the road, agencies may see a huge reduction in the industrial base. The former executive also points to the inconsistency in the message that the administration is sending. They're going after the 8A program, but at the same time, they're saying the government wants new participants in the federal market, non-traditionals, if you will. But these are the folks who will depend on small business offices and programs like 8A to help them get a foot in the door. Now, Shiraka is probably a little more specific. He says DoD's audit is part of a concerted effort to really undermine the 8A program.
Given what we've seen with respect to the SBA audit, given what we've seen with respect to the number of 8As being approved, last year, 2024, there was something like 500 plus 8As approved. 2025, I think the last count I saw was 66 approved. And so given the audits, the slowdown in processing, and the sort of the contracting officers looking over their shoulders, I think in the short term, given the current administration and the current congressional makeup, if you will, in the short term, we will see a trend away from the 8A program.
And that trend away would be a big mistake. Abdullah from Hui Hulilal says going away from the 8A program would not just affect DoD, but really every agency.
It's not a death knell, but it's absolutely going to leave a mark. It's absolutely going to hinder our ability to bring some of that new technology, that new manufacturing capability to the federal marketplace. That's probably my bigger concern is, we're behind in terms of the ability to manufacture here in the U.S. and have outsourced that to we've outsourced it beyond what one should in the defense of their own country. And so hindering the ability for us to help bring some of that to bear in the U.S. marketplace is probably the biggest concern.
Jason, thanks so much for bringing us this story. I know a lot of people are going to be watching how this plays out.
A lot more news to come as well. Thanks, Terry.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a new year brings new opportunities. Where should contractors focus in 2026? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Deltek's latest analysis highlights the top federal programs and sectors poised for growth. Here to share what's on the horizon and how contractors can position for success is Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek, Kevin Plexico. Kevin, it's great to have you back.
Oh, thank you so much, Terry. It's great to be here.
Deltek has a new report out that's looking ahead for federal contractor intelligence for 2026. But before we look forward, I want to look back a little bit. When you think of everything that happened in the contracting space in 2025, what stands out for you as the biggest trends?
Well, chaos reigned supreme this past year for sure. What I find just super interesting is that some companies, happen to find themselves in really good places and aligned to the goals of the new administration and did really well. And others that happened to be in sort of the wrong place at the wrong time had profound impact. And I think 2025 was really a year where companies had to really take stock of the organizations that they're selling to and their offerings to make sure they're aligned to the goals of the administration and the mission that the government agencies have been asked to take on by that administration. And that's probably, to me, the biggest change is just there's been so much movement of money, in some cases, money coming out of certain agencies. We've all heard about Agency for International Development and the Department of State and Education. But then you look at organizations like the VA, DHS, and DoD that have continued to do really well. So a lot of haves and have-nots this year. And I think for companies, it's just trying to figure out, based on this new administration, where should we really be aiming to be able to capitalize on it going forward?
Every administration comes in with different priorities, but it seems like this one was able to make the pendulum swing really fast, and that may have caught companies off guard. What are some of the hard conversations that had to happen inside those boardrooms?
Well, early on, it was all about DOGE and the DOGE organization really putting some, I think, unprecedented pressure on some of its vendors. I mean, some of the letters I saw sent to professional services companies and some of the demands that were made of value-added resellers were just not anything I've seen a federal agency communicate to a vendor before that was otherwise performing to the jobs that they were asked to do. And I think it's in some respects a bit surreal that the administration was asking companies to identify wasteful spending. It's just an awkward situation to be in if you have a customer and the customer already hired you to do the work and you're now being asked to identify where there's wasteful spending in that and sort of serve up cuts. So I think that was the early part of the year. We did see that start to sunset a bit and fade as we got into the summertime. But then all of a sudden, all eyes were turning to appropriations and funding for 2026. And we all know where that's landed, which is, it hasn't. We're still waiting for full year 2026 with just a couple agency exceptions. And we bought some time ending the shutdown, which was, as you know, the longest on record. But there's nothing to say that we might not have another shutdown here at the end of January. So I still think where there's that bit of uncertainty, I think the one silver lining this past year for the contracting community is the One Big Beautiful Bill, just because it had so much opportunity in it for contractors that really cut across the gamut of aerospace, defense, professional services, training, architecture, engineering, construction. There's literally something in there for everybody, but it does require really an honest assessment by a company to figure out, okay, how do we get after this? Because that might not be in the agencies that they're used to doing business in.
Right. And a lot of those funds haven't been dispersed yet, so they're still maybe in the RFP or RFQ stage. This unpredictability of funding flows is something you don't normally see in government contracts. Everything from stop work orders and termination notices earlier in the year to unpaid bills at the end of the fiscal year and the CR. Has that caused the GovCon community to sort of reevaluate and readjust their planning for predictable cash flows?
So I think this year, while it was a record-setting shutdown, is not an unusual year in that we don't have, line of sight on when appropriations are going to get done. I think industry has become used to that scenario, and while shutdowns are certainly not good for anyone, they're usually relatively short-lived because of what happens. The pain gets so severe that finally Congress is like, we're inflicting a lot of pain on rank and file Americans. We need to, resolve this. And I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail the next time that this comes around. What I think is perhaps different this time versus what we've seen, say, the last decade or so is we've always had a bipartisan budget agreement or resolution that sort of set the top line that appropriators were negotiating towards. I think we've had that literally for about a decade since back during the Budget Control Act, and we don't have that for 26. So there was no goalpost that Congress was working towards on a bipartisan basis that they agreed on, previously, and I think that's the same for 2027. So I think that's what's unique about this is there's nothing that says here's the goal that we're working towards, and then how do we allocate it by the different appropriations bills that are negotiated.
Kevin Plexico is Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek. Kevin, let's turn our attention to the windshield and not the rearview mirror now. With all of that disruption in 2025, what is at the top of Deltek's intelligence report for 2026?
Well, I think 2026 is going to be a better year than 2025, thanks primarily to the One Big Beautiful Bill. As you pointed out, it's not a single year appropriation. The funding in that legislation lasts through, I think it has to be obligated by the end of 2029. I'm sorry, committed in contracts essentially by then. It can then be expenditures can take longer. So that gives us a bit of time, and it certainly doesn't mean that it has to get rushed out the door like we've seen some emergency supplemental appropriations have had that shape. And so that provides some longer term opportunity and ability for companies to reposition to get after some of that money. The biggest challenge on the base level appropriations, we've got this ambitious goal of growing defense spending paid for by significant cuts in civilian spending. And we saw that under the prior Trump administration, but they were never able to get appropriators to buy off on that. And I think that's the dynamic that we have in the Senate, where it has to get 60 votes to get past the filibuster. It does really need a bipartisan level agreement to get appropriations done. And that's particularly challenging in these contentious times, but I do think it helps prevent those draconian cuts that could be put in place for some civilian agencies that we've seen this and the prior Trump administration ask for that usually have not been enacted.
One of the sectors that's really struggled this past year is small businesses. What do you see in the future for them?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because on the one hand, the government has done a really good job of spending money with small business. But if you look at the level of participation in terms of prime contracts, it's going down. The number of small businesses, I think, has declined by close to 30% over the last several years in terms of prime contracting. And I think that's a problem that the administration really has to take a look at. And unfortunately, some of the things that we're seeing them do around relying on best-in-class contracts, don't create a new contract if there's already an existing contract that you can place a task or delivery order under. Those really favor the companies that already have those prime contracts, and I think it makes it challenging for small businesses to enter the market. On the research and development side, we're still waiting for Congress to extend the SBIR and STTR programs, which are small business innovative research related work. So it's a challenging market for I think all companies, but in particular for small businesses. They're dependent on cash flow. Shutdowns particularly impact small businesses. The rule changes that are being made in the FAR overhaul are pretty profound in terms of their impact on small business. I think it's unpredictable to understand how much is it going to affect, a service-disabled veteran-owned business versus an 8A company versus a women-owned business. And it seems like they're gravitating more towards our preference is just small business set-asides and trying to get away from sole source awards. And that's a big change for the small business community for sure. So I think getting smart about the new rules and how they're going to be applied agency by agency is going to be super important for small businesses.
Well, speaking about the FAR overhaul, let's talk about GSA for a minute. They've really worked over this last year to centralize a lot of buying strategies, centralize a lot of contracts. They've updated the OASIS contract. What are you seeing, and what should contractors be expecting to hear from GSA?
Well, I think the thing that's created a lot of confusion is the way they're rolling it out. Usually when FAR changes are rolled out, they go through a rulemaking process, they issue drafts, take comments, and then go to a final rule or interim rule. What they've done in this particular situation is, instead of approaching it in that traditional way, they've rolled out the revised FAR and basically said that agencies can adopt it if they get a class deviation. So you have to literally go to the FAR overhaul website and see which agencies have adopted these FAR clauses. And right now, you basically have different agencies using different versions of the FAR. The DoD is still using the traditional FAR and DFAR. They don't have any class deviations that I'm aware of, but many civilian agencies do. So it just puts a lot of onus on the contracting community to really be mindful of what regulations are being followed by the agency you're selling to, because it's not the same as everybody's following the FAR anymore. Which version of the FAR? Is it this class deviation or is it the traditional FAR? And that's just an example of, the chaos that we talked about, I think.
If you could give contractors one piece of advice as they're trying to put their 2026 business strategies together, what would it be?
I go to what we call the 4 C's, customers. Who are the right customers that you're going to be focused on selling to? Contracts, what vehicles are they going to be using to get access to those providers? Compliance, what do you need to be able to comply with? And I know CMMC is a big one, but even with all the FAR overhaul changes, I haven't seen what I would call a deregulation of compliance requirements. There's pressure on agencies to use more fixed price that would potentially take away some of the accounting requirements that come along with a cost plus contract. I think I might have missed a C in that, but you get the gist of it, right? It's really just being more strategic and being more thoughtful about how you're going to go to market. And you can't just afford to live off the agencies you've been doing business with, because they might be starving for money going forward. So you really have to take an honest assessment of where you are today, where you want to play, and how are you going to position yourself to get there, because it's not a quick pivot by any stretch.
I've been speaking with Kevin Plexico. He's Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek. Kevin, thanks for sharing your insights.
Terry, thanks so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, GAO warns disaster readiness gaps could leave communities exposed when the next storm hits. But first, with a new executive order clearing the path for federal AI standards, the question now is whether Congress will finish the job. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. States are racing to regulate AI, creating a patchwork that Kevin Frazier warns could stifle innovation. Now, a sweeping executive order asserts federal preemption and launches a litigation task force to challenge state laws. Frazier joins us to unpack the constitutional stakes and whether Congress will finally step in. Kevin, it's great to have you back on the show.
Terry, thanks for the invitation.
Last time we spoke, we were talking about the potential of a patchwork of state laws that might stifle AI innovation. Now, we don't have a federal law, but we have an executive order from the president that creates a federal preemption framework and a task force that will specifically challenge those state laws. Last time we talked, we were worried about constitutionality. What do you think about this new construct?
Yeah, so this construct really tries to set forth a path for Congress to step up. I think everyone across the board at the state level, in the White House, is asking Congress to take action. And this, in many ways, is meant to smooth that path and ease the way forward for Congress to finally set forth a national framework. And by virtue of establishing an AI litigation task force, the president is trying to make sure that Congress has a clear path to move forward. This AI litigation task force is essentially charging the Department of Justice under the Attorney General to challenge state AI laws that may be unconstitutional or otherwise unlawful. Now, critically, this is not saying that states do not have the authority to regulate AI in certain domains, but merely giving and encouraging the AG to have a more focused regulatory agenda, focusing their litigation challenges on state AI laws that may have extraterritorial ramifications, that may violate the First Amendment, other things that the DOJ has always had the authority to do.
Where do you think then that this sets the balance between innovation and state autonomy and federal authority?
So the balance is constantly being weighed here, Terry. I'd say that this is trying to strike a happy middle ground. We see that in the executive order, there's explicit recognition that in many ways there may be state laws that actually do empower and encourage innovation. We know that in 2026, we're going to see Texas, my home state, develop a regulatory sandbox that allows for AI companies to deploy their tools under fewer regulations, but with increased oversight. Utah has explored a similar approach. And so those sorts of state laws that are very much operating within their own borders, that are regulating the end uses of AI, or as specified in the executive order, things like data center locations, things like child safety protections, and things like state government use of AI, those are all cordoned off and recognized by the EO as the proper domain of states. And now the EO is really encouraging Congress to say, look, we're trying to do our best to make sure that states aren't regulating things like the frontier of AI, imposing obligations on AI development. But Congress, you need to step up, because it is you, after all, that has the authority under the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce.
Let's go back to those sandboxes that you talked about, because we talked about those before, and you talked about them as a smart way of creating a trial and error space for AI governance. Does this EO then align with those, and do you expect more states to move in that direction?
Yes, so this EO very much encourages and welcomes state regulations that, again, aren't running afoul of the Constitution or aren't otherwise running afoul of federal laws or regulations that may preempt certain regulatory postures by the states. If you're not doing something unconstitutional, if you're not trying to violate the Supremacy Clause, there's a wide range for states to occupy with respect to AI governance. And here, those sorts of sandboxes are the sort of innovation-friendly approaches that I think the White House and members of Congress and many state legislators would like to see spread and continue to be developed. And these are really the sorts of approaches that allow us to get used to and start acclimating to what I like to refer to as boring AI. The fact of the matter is, most AI isn't something that's going to threaten humanity. It's not something that's going to destroy the economy tomorrow, so on and so forth. Most AI, Terry, is really boring. It's things like improving our ability to detect diseases, improving our ability to direct the transmission of energy. And these sorts of positive, admittedly boring uses of AI are the very sorts of things we should be trying to experiment with at the state level.
I'm speaking with Dr. Kevin Frazier. He is the AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas School of Law. Kevin, one of the other things we've talked about is that the uncertainty around AI laws and regulations really creates a barrier to entry for innovators or startups or small businesses in the AI space. How do you think the EO affects that concern?
So the EO is very attentive to what I would refer to not only as a patchwork, but increasingly what's looking like a Tower of Babel approach that we're seeing at the state level. So most recently in New York, we saw that the governor signed legislation that looks a lot like SB 53. Now, for folks who aren't spending all of their waking hours thinking about AI, SB 53 was a bill passed in California that regulates the frontier AI companies and imposes various transparency requirements on them. Now, New York, in some ways, copy and pasted that legislation. Folks may say, oh, this is great. States are trying to copy one another to make sure that there is some sort of harmony with respect to AI regulation. Well, the problem is how states end up interpreting those same provisions, what it means, for example, to have a reasonable model, or what it means to adhere to certain transparency requirements. That may vary in terms of state by state enforcement. And so that's really where there is concern among the White House with respect to extraterritorial laws. Because if suddenly we see that a AI company in Utah or Texas feels compelled or is compelled to comply with New York laws or California laws, that's really where we start to see that concern about a patchwork.
And what does that mean for innovators who may want to scale up? They may get a great start in Utah, for example, but how do they scale up nationwide if there is that patchwork?
And Terry, this is a really important question because there's an argument to be made that bills like SB 53 or the RAISE Act in New York include carve-outs for smaller AI labs. And some folks will say, hey, look, it says if you're not building a model of this size or with this much money, or if you don't have this many users, then great. You don't have to comply with this specific regulation. Well, the problem is, Terry, I have yet to meet a startup founder who says, I can't wait to build this new AI tool, but the second I hit 999,000 users, I'm just going to stop building. Or the second that I want to build a model that's just one order of magnitude more powerful in terms of compute, I'm just going to turn it off. I'm going to throw in the towel. And so even when there are carve-outs, we see that startups have to begin to think about when they're going to run into those regulatory burdens. And so even with carve-outs applied across the patchwork approach, we're going to see that startups find it harder and harder to convince venture capitalists, to convince institutions to bet and gamble on them. And that's a real problem if we want to be the leaders in AI innovation.
So let's go back then to the DOJ's litigation task force. How might that play into this confusion? Will it clarify it? Will it add more complexity? What's your prognostication?
Yes, always love to prognosticate. And I think that here we're going to see some positive litigation be brought forward that allows some of these really important, difficult debates to finally be litigated. There's questions about what it means to regulate interstate commerce in the AI domain. We need experts to have honest and frank conversations about this, and litigation can be a very valuable forcing mechanism for having folks suddenly say, hey, if you regulate this aspect of AI, then from a technical standpoint, it may not pose any issues. But if you regulate this aspect, now we're starting to see that labs would have to change their behavior. And so litigation can be a very positive step that sends signals to state legislators, hey, here are the areas where it's clear for you to proceed, and here are the areas where the Constitution says, whoa, that's Congress's domain. And so I'm optimistic that under the leadership of the Attorney General and seeing folks like David Sachs, the AI and crypto czar, lend their expertise to these challenges as well, that we're going to get the sort of information we need at the state and federal level for both parties to be more thoughtful about the sorts of regulations they should impose.
All right, Kevin, underlying all of the things you've just talked about is the concern you raised at the beginning. Will Congress step up and enact national legislation? What should be at the top of their list if they're going to move forward on this?
So the thing at the top of Congress's list, in my opinion, has to be novel approaches, number one, to AI research. We just need to understand better how AI works, things like that black box concept we talk about frequently with respect to AI, and things like making sure that if AI ends up in the hands of bad actors, we know how to respond. Congress can really put a lot of energy behind those important AI research initiatives. We also need Congress to help make sure we have more data be available to more researchers and startups so that we don't find ourselves just operating under the AI world of OpenAI, Microsoft, and Anthropic, but we want to see real competition in this space, and Congress can make sure that the essential inputs to AI development are more broadly available. And finally, I think Congress can do a lot of work with respect to improving the amount of information we're receiving from AI companies. So SB 53, for example, is a great example of a state bill that's trying to garner more information from AI labs that can then lead to smarter, better regulation down the road. But the best approach is for Congress to take the lead on imposing those requirements, not states.
Dr. Kevin Frazier is the AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas School of Law. Kevin, thanks again for adding such clarity to this topic for us.
Always a pleasure, Terry. Thank you again.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, GAO warns disaster readiness gaps could leave communities exposed when the next storm hits. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. GAO's latest high-risk report flags uneven preparedness across states and localities, despite billions in FEMA grants and expanded training programs. We'll explore what drives these disparities, how performance is measured, and the implications of a bigger local role in future disasters, with Christopher Curry, Director, Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Curry, it's nice to see you again.
You too. Thank you.
A couple of months ago, we covered your first report in this Disaster Assistance High Risk series where you looked at the federal response workforce. You're back with report number 2, looking at state and local response capabilities. Talk to us about the headlines.
Well, the headline for this report is that the capabilities of state and local governments across the country vary drastically for a disaster or other type of event. You know, what we did is we actually look at data that the states prepare and provide to FEMA as part of their justification for federal preparedness grants. It's meant to be a very, very honest self-assessment of capabilities. And for that reason, we actually don't provide states individually. We sort of roll it up and wrap it up anonymously because some of that information, as you imagine, could be sensitive. But, you know, we looked at states that have been involved in major disasters over the last 2 to 3 years, and some of these states are very experienced, large states, and even they vary in terms of their capabilities. There's actually 32 capabilities that FEMA sets in the National Preparedness System that you want to achieve to be prepared to respond for a disaster or a large event. And states vary. Some of the areas they were less than 10% prepared. Met less than 10% of those capabilities, and others, there were much more. So the reason that's important right now is to understand that if you were to change the support that FEMA and the federal government provide to states quickly, then they're going to have capability gaps that are going to have to get filled.
Let's talk about some of the support that FEMA does provide. One of the ways that they support the states is through preparedness grants, and those help build local capacity. What did you find as you dug into the preparedness grants?
Those preparedness grants started after 9/11, and since 9/11, there's been like over $60 billion provided to states. It's the main way that the federal government transfers funds to state and local governments to get them ready to handle something bad that could happen, not just a natural disaster, but it could be a terrorist attack. And those grants have built capabilities tremendously over the years. But those capabilities change over time, and we identify through real-world events and exercises the gaps that still need to be addressed. So I'll give you a great example. After Hurricane Helene and after other disasters, housing for disaster survivors is always a perennial challenge. Housing is an area, it's a capability area that is assessed, and we want to build up through these preparedness grants. It's an area that states, even very experienced disaster states, still fall short of in terms of their capabilities. And the federal government kind of comes in after disaster and provides a lot of that support because states don't. So if the federal government's not going to provide it, then someone else is going to have to provide it, and that's going to be someone at the state or local level.
Talk to me about the flexibility and the allocation framework for these grants. Is it meeting requirements? Does it seem to be focused on the places that have the greatest need?
Yeah, the grants are actually given out. There's a couple different ways they're given out. There's a portion of the grants that are supposed to go towards certain national priorities, and FEMA sets those targets. So think about things like election security or other national priorities. But then a large part of the grants they're discretionary, and the states can use them, and they're supposed to use them in the areas where they assess they have gaps. And that's the data I was talking about earlier that we provided. So, for example, certain states may have gaps in their ability to handle a mass casualty situation, or may struggle to house disaster survivors because they don't have a lot of housing stock or rental. So those are things they're supposed to identify and then target those grants towards those specific areas, which makes sense. You want to close your gaps so you're ready to go when something happens.
FEMA also provides a great deal of training and technical assistance. How effective has that been in helping states be ready?
Since this is, I think, one of the biggest success stories since Hurricane Katrina. If you remember Hurricane Katrina, the issue was the role of various levels of government was not clear, and thus nobody stepped up and was proactive in responding to that event. People lost their lives. Since that time, the National Preparedness System and FEMA leading that has been extremely effective through exercises, through training, through just regional relationships in taking care of a lot of those problems. So today we are way more proactive and responsive to disasters than we were 20 years ago in Hurricane Katrina. And so that's a huge success story. Having said that, a disaster is a disaster. There's always going to be things that happen that you don't expect. And there's areas where states still have major gaps and that require resources and people to address those. And the federal government comes in and fills a lot of those gaps. Here's a great example. Hurricane Helene happened and devastated a very remote part of our country in places like, rural Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia. States and localities don't have the search and rescue assets, for such a large swath of that kind of terrain. Federal government provided a lot of that. They provided a lot of the air support, the land support, the temporary bridges, Army Corps of Engineers. So, the federal government really kicks in when something's too big for a state or locality to handle.
I'm speaking with Chris Curry. He's Director, Homeland Security and Justice at GAO. So, Chris, all of this begs the question. This administration has been very clear that it wants states and localities to pick up more of the disaster response mission and that it wants a much smaller FEMA. Given what you found in your first study about the federal response workforce and the impacts of downsizing there, and now the variability in state and local readiness, what are the implications for national disaster response?
I want to make one thing really clear, because all I know is what we know now and what the data that we've looked at. And I want to be clear that nothing has changed in terms of FEMA's responsibilities today. There's been a lot of talk about it. There's been the President's Council that studied it, but there has been no change so far. So FEMA is still responsible for what it was responsible for 2 years ago. They have lost some staff. We looked at that in our first report, as you mentioned. They've lost about 1,000 staff and maybe a little bit more than that at this point. But they haven't been cut drastically or cut in half as has been discussed. So they still have the same responsibilities, and they're still performing the same functions on disasters throughout the country, even though last year we didn't have a huge landfalling hurricane. So what's important about that is that, everybody's waiting to hear what the next steps are going to be and, what's going to happen to FEMA. One of the things we wanted to do in this report is we wanted to provide a comprehensive picture of preparedness to show what's going to be necessary if that FEMA support is pulled back or FEMA is made smaller. And the bottom line is that states and localities are going to have to do more. However, it's going to be critical that they have the time to prepare for that. For example, a lot of the assistance that's provided to individual survivors, like cash payments and housing, that comes from the federal government. It does not come from the state or local government. So if FEMA is not going to be providing that, the state or the locality is going to have to fill that need. And that requires a lot of money and a lot of preparation and planning that you can't just turn on in a heartbeat. You don't want to start figuring out programs to help people after a disaster happens.
You bring up a good point on that time to prepare. As you did this survey, you talked to lots of state and local response officials. What did they tell you beyond time to prepare that they were going to need to be effective?
Very simple. Just tell us what we need to do. Tell us what we're going to expect from you, the federal government. Nobody knows right now. The FEMA Council has not finished its work. There has been reform legislation introduced in the House and in the Senate, but nothing has passed yet. So the key message is, tell us what the roles and responsibilities are going to be so we know what to prepare for so we don't get caught flat-footed in the case of something really bad happening. And, Terry, one of my fears is that last year, like I said, we didn't have a large landfalling hurricane. It was the first year in a long time we did not. We did not have a large catastrophic disaster other than Los Angeles fires early in the year. So my fear is that folks are going to look at last year and say, hey, things have gone pretty well. We don't need to be thinking about it. And that is an absolute mistake because, we've seen in years like 2017, 2018, 2024, my fear is we're going to have, another situation this year or next with, multiple concurrent disasters, and we're just not going to have the resources to deal with them.
So what will you be watching for in the next few months to see if Congress and the federal government and the states have taken your recommendations on board?
Well, I would like to, when the FEMA Council report comes out, I would like to see in whatever the execution is for FEMA reform or the changes in how the system works now, I would like to see an understanding of how this needs to be rolled out so states and localities can prepare and have as clear roles and responsibilities as possible. We'd also like to see them address many of the problems that we've pointed out. And to be clear, we've pointed out a number of issues with FEMA, particularly in the frustrating recovery phase. I want to see that they're making sure that we don't break what's not broken and we fix the issues that are broken. And there are a number of those things.
I've been speaking with Chris Curry. He's Director, Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you so much for sharing this report and for this important work.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Transportation Security Administration employees will continue to have a union after a new court ruling. That's because a federal judge blocked TSA's latest attempt to dissolve a 2024 collective bargaining agreement that covers some 47,000 airport screeners. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more on the case and what comes next. Justin, great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
So fill us in on the background here. Why was TSA's new attempt to eliminate the collective bargaining agreement rejected?
Well, TSA has been trying to eliminate the union agreement for airport screeners for almost a year now. This started back in March when Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem first issued a directive to eliminate collective bargaining at TSA. The American Federation of Government Employees sued, and in a June ruling, a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking that action, finding that AFGE may have grounds to block the dissolution of the collective bargaining agreement. Well, in September, Kristi Noem issued a new directive, essentially saying that DHS has done a new analysis and that they are again going to try to eliminate TSA's collective bargaining agreement because, in their view, it is not in the interests of TSA. Well, of course, AFGE sought to have that order or directive blocked. They argued that it was essentially an end around the preliminary injunction issued in June, and U.S. District Judge Jamal Whitehead agreed with that, essentially saying that TSA and DHS here are violating the terms of that ruling, which said that TSA shall not infringe upon the collective bargaining rights of airport screeners while it's in force. So that's where we're at today. TSA's union agreement was set to go away over the weekend, but now with this latest ruling, it is still in effect while this court case plays out.
Why is the Trump administration so set on getting rid of the collective bargaining agreement at TSA?
Well, we know this administration is obviously against unions generally within the federal government, and certainly at TSA, which is kind of a special case. It's a newer agency, of course. It is not under Title V, so it's not covered by the same union rights that other federal agencies' employees have. And so over time, TSA has slowly gained collective bargaining rights that are on par with other federal employees. This administration has come in and said that the costs of collective bargaining at TSA, the fact that managers have to deal with union matters instead of focusing on frontline airport screening issues, and an increase in unscheduled absences under the collective bargaining agreement all add up to a need to do away with the TSA union agreement. And I think it's interesting if you look back at Project 2025, There was a goal in there to privatize airport screening and to move away from having government airport screeners in the first place. And Project 2025 specifically says that until it is privatized, TSA should be treated as a national security provider and its workforce should be de-unionized immediately. So certainly the administration is moving toward at least de-unionizing for now. They haven't said that they want to privatize airport screening publicly, but their de-unionization efforts are on hold for now.
And what does AFGE have to say about the latest ruling?
Of course, they're celebrating it. They're saying essentially that the administration's efforts to strip TSA workers of a voice on their working conditions should concern people who go to airports. Their point is that TSA's workforce has gained these union rights because for a long time, TSA has struggled with attrition, with being a less than desirable place to work within the federal government. And so over time, TSA staff have gained not just increased salaries, but with this 2024 collective bargaining agreement, union rights that are on par with other federal employees. So things like sick leave, things like uniform allowances are all covered under this expanded collective bargaining agreement that AFGE says is needed to have a well-functioning TSA.
Well, TSA was really on the front lines during the government shutdown as well. So do they have a sense that the collective bargaining agreement helped them maintain the workforce during that difficult time?
Well, certainly the fact that they have expanded rights under that collective bargaining agreement so that they are not necessarily as subject to the whims of management when it comes to sick leave, as we've discussed. The Trump administration has a different view on that. They view that as a big cost under this collective bargaining agreement that's unjustified. But, the fact that TSA employees got higher salaries several years ago, and the Congress has continued to fund those higher salaries through appropriations. I heard from several TSA employees that they were able to weather the storm of a shutdown more easily because they're making more money and they know that they're going to have a bigger paycheck on the back end rather than having what was effectively close to minimum wage for a starter employee at TSA several years ago. So there's a lot of issues swirling around the TSA workforce at any one time. They're required to work through shutdowns. They're at the front lines of travel during a time of really record travel that's only going to increase even more. And so I think both Congress and even the administration, while they're trying to do away with the union, are acutely attuned to the impact that any changes at TSA have on travel and the ability for people to move around airports and move around the United States.
Well, it seems like this might not be the end of the argument. What do you expect to happen next?
Right now, this case is actually scheduled to go to trial in September. I would expect that DHS and TSA may try to move sooner than that to either appeal some of these rulings or to get this dismissed even earlier than that. But right now, that's where the case is scheduled to go. And in the meantime, they are supposed to be honoring that 2024 collective bargaining agreement that's in place until 2031, absent it being, of course, done away with. And so that's where TSA's workforce is today as they ramp up for a pretty big summer with the World Cup and with America 250th anniversary events coming down the pipeline. So it's going to be a busy, busy year at TSA.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for this story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.